There is this amazing incident involving a guy named Gabriel Bathory. And yes, we will definitely hear that last name again shortly.
A very famous last name.
Very. So Gabriel was the Prince of Transylvania, and he was getting a little too ambitious. He wanted to get his hands on a specific royal crown that the Ottoman Sultan had given to someone else.
It was the crown of Stefan Bocskai. And Thurzo understood the geopolitical domino effect perfectly.
What would have happened?
Well, if Gabriel Bathory got his hands on that crown, it would legitimize a rebellion, trigger a regional war, and give the Ottomans an excuse to march west.
So it's a powder keg.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Thurzo didn't send a letter. In June 1610, the Palatine of the kingdom personally rode out with his men, visited the guardian of the crown at a place called Blatny Potok, essentially confiscated the crown, and transported it straight to the heavily guarded vaults of Vienna for safekeeping.
He literally pulled off a royal heist.
He really did.
He just rode in, grabbed the most dangerous piece of jewelry in Eastern Europe, and rode out to stop a war. It's like an Ocean's 11 plot, but with horses and armor.
Just another Tuesday for Juraj Thurzo.
Exactly. Yeah. But as impressive as his administrative and diplomatic work was, Thurzo knew that giving his people rotating mayoralties wasn't enough. If he wanted to secure the long-term survival of the Slovak identity, he needed to secure their spiritual independence.
Right.
And this leads to what I think is his most brilliant and arguably most dangerous political move.
We were talking about the Synod of Julina.
Yes.
To fully grasp the magnitude of this event, we have to look at the religious architecture of the time. Up until Thurzo used his power as Palatine to intervene, the Lutheran believers in this region were in a precarious, legally ambiguous position.
How so?
They existed, they worshipped, but they were technically and administratively still living under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. They had no legally distinct, protected institution of their own.
So they were essentially a massive group of rogue tenants renting space in a building owned by a landlord who actively despised them and wanted them evicted.
Precisely. The Catholic hierarchy could, theoretically, crack down on them at any moment.
Sure.
So Thurzo, leveraging his absolute authority as Palatine, decided to build them their own house.
The Synod.
Right. He used an old, somewhat obscure coronation charter from King Matej as his legal loophole to convene a synod. It was a logistical nightmare, though.
I bet.
It was originally planned for June 1609, but due to his overwhelming duties running the kingdom and low initial turnout, it was delayed. It finally took place over 3 days, from March 28th to the 30th in 1610.
And the guest list for this synod is a fascinating snapshot of how he engineered the demographics. He brought together representatives from 10 Danube districts. He gathered 26 priests specifically from the Slovak lands, 1 representative from Vienna, and 11 from the German provinces.
In those 3 intense days, Thurzo didn't just organize a church. He laid the permanent legal foundation for an independent evangelical infrastructure, but he designed it with a distinctly Slovak character.
Which is key.
It is a crucial distinction because the ethnic Hungarians in the region who had broken from the Catholic Church largely leaned toward the Calvinist faith. Thurzo was building a Lutheran church for his people.
Okay.
He established 3 supervisory councils, known as superintendencies, and based them in Bitij, Brezno, and Bojnice.
But here's the absolute power move. This is the moment where Thurzo flexes his muscle. What did he do with the German-speaking evangelicals?
Oh, he legally subordinated them. He placed the German-speaking evangelical congregations directly under the supervision of the Slovak overseers.
Which is wild, because historically, the German patrician class always dominated the administrative structures. Thurzo completely flipped the power dynamic of the era.
He did. And to cement this new identity, he made Biblical Slavic the official liturgical language for these newly organized Slovak Lutherans. They would pray, read, and conduct services in a language that belonged to them, not in Latin or German.
Okay, I have to stop and ask the obvious question. How in the world did he get away with this?
It's a miracle he did.
Right, he is the Palatine. He answers directly to a fiercely Catholic, uncompromising Habsburg emperor in Vienna. And right under the emperor's nose, he uses a legal loophole to carve out a massive, legally recognized Protestant infrastructure, subordinates the Germans to the Slovaks, and institutionalizes a non-Latin language. Why didn't the emperor just have him beheaded for treason?
Because of the principle of sheer indispensability we discussed earlier, but amplified by the realities of statecraft.
The troops again.
Yeah. The emperor was furious, of course, but what was the alternative? If you execute Juraj Thurzo, you instantly alienate the most powerful military commander in the East.
And cause a rebellion.
Exactly. You risk a massive Protestant uprising in your own backyard, while the Ottomans are waiting for any sign of weakness to attack. Thurzo forced a stalemate. He walked this incredibly delicate, terrifying tightrope, using his own untouchable status to build a permanent sanctuary for his people.
Unbelievable.
By intertwining their religious faith with their ethnic language, by making Biblical Slavic the language of their salvation, he permanently solidified the Slovak nationality he had been championing.
It really makes you wonder about the butterfly effect in history. If Thurzo hadn't institutionalized the language in the church at that exact precise moment in 1610, what would have happened to the Slovak identity?
It might have vanished.
Right, would it have survived? Or would it have been slowly absorbed, assimilated, and erased by the immense cultural gravity of the surrounding German and Hungarian empires? It is very possible that without the Synod of Elena, the cultural identity wouldn't exist today.
It's very possible.
He anchored the culture to the church. But while Thurzo was busy rewriting the religious and political map of Central Europe, a truly dark, horrifying crisis was unfolding in his own backyard. A crisis that would require him to put down the diplomat's pen and pick up the sword of the Chief Justice.
Yes. We are shifting gears entirely now, moving from political history into what is essentially a 17th century true crime thriller.
It really is.
Juraj Thurzo is the man who investigated, raided, and prosecuted the horrific crimes of Elizabeth Bathory.
The Blood Countess. Now, for you listening, this isn't just a story about a random judge catching a random killer. This gets intensely, uncomfortably personal for Thurzo.
Very personal.
Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just some nameless noblewoman. She was the widow of a man named Ferenc Nadezhdy. And Nadezhdy was Thurzo's old comrade in arms. They had ridden into battle together against the Turks. So Thurzo is tasked with investigating the widow of a celebrated war hero that he actually knew personally.
And the rumors have been swirling around her estate, Ada's castle, for years. Whispers of young peasant girls going to the castle for work and never returning.
Terrifying.
The local clergy had complained, the families were terrified, but because of her immense rank, no one dared touch her. Finally, the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. In late 1610, Thurzo, acting as Palatine and Chief Justice, decided to strike.
And he didn't mess around.
No, he didn't just send a polite envoy with a subpoena. Accompanied by Bathory's own son-in-law and a heavily armed military unit, Thurzo launched a surprise dead-of-night raid on the castle.
And they didn't just find circumstantial evidence or buried bones. They caught her completely red-handed. The historical records state that when Thurzo and his men kicked the doors in, the scene was straight out of a nightmare.
It was a slaughterhouse.
Yeah, Bathory was actively in the middle of torturing a young girl. Another girl was already dead on the floor, and a third was dying.
You have to consider the profound psychological shock of that moment. Thurzo was a warlord. He was intimately familiar with the gruesome reality of combat and death on the battlefield.
But this was different.
Completely different. To walk into the private home of an old friend's widow and discover a sadistic slaughterhouse, that is a distinctly different, shattering kind of horror. It's the betrayal of the aristocratic code, the betrayal of humanity.
But he doesn't freeze. The soldier takes over. He secures the castle, arrests her, and immediately acts as Chief Justice. He condemns Elizabeth Bathory to life imprisonment, ordering her to be bricked up and locked inside her own fortress, Soctus Castle.
Right.
She would remain trapped in those rooms until she died a few years later on August 21st, 1614. But while the mastermind got house arrest, the real, brutal, terrifying swiftness of 17th century justice fell upon her accomplices.
Thurzo established a 24-member court right in his capital Ibiza to try the servants who helped her. He appointed a man named Juraj Thurzo to chair it.
Why, 24 members?
The use of a 24-member court was a deliberate legal mechanism to spread the political liability and ensure a veneer of due process. But the sentences they handed down were horrifyingly brutal.
They were.
They reflect the extreme, violent severity with which the feudal legal system treated commoners who participated in the murder of their peers, especially under a high-profile scandal.
The details from the trial records are genuinely hard to read. Two of the female accomplices, women named Helena Jo and Dorota Sentisova, were subjected to unspeakable torture. An executioner literally used hot iron tongs to tear their fingers off their hands before they were thrown into a fire and burned alive.
It's horrific.
And a male accomplice, Jan Uzvari, who went by the nickname Fico, was beheaded, and his body was thrown onto the border of the property as a warning.
It is gruesome, but it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of feudal justice and class privilege. Which brings us to a massive contradiction.
The difference in the sentences.
Right. Why did the accomplices, the servants who are likely coerced or terrified into obeying their sadistic master face unimaginable torture and a fiery execution, while the actual mastermind, the woman who directed and enjoyed the murders, got to live out her days in her own castle?
Exactly. It feels like a massive miscarriage of justice. And what is wild is that King Matej II, the emperor in Vienna, was actually furious with Thurzo's ruling.
Was.
But the king wasn't angry because the servants were tortured without a fair trial. The king was angry because he felt Thurzo was protecting his own class. The king essentially sent a letter saying, "Why didn't you execute the countess too? She's a murderer."
This is where Thurzo, the politician, had to override Thurzo, the judge. He was navigating an incredibly explosive political minefield. Elizabeth Bathory was a high-ranking aristocrat. Her family, the Bathories, were incredibly wealthy and commanded private armies.
So they were untouchable.
Almost. Her late husband was a national hero. In the 17th century, the state executing a senior noblewoman was almost unheard of. It threatened the entire social order.
Right.
Thurzo knew that if he dragged a countess to the executioner's block and chopped her head off, her family might revolt. It could spark a civil war among the Hungarian nobility right when the Ottomans were looking for an excuse to invade.
So her imprisonment was a calculated political compromise. It stopped the murders instantly. It removed her from society forever. It seized her assets, but it avoided setting the dangerous legal precedent of the state executing an untouchable aristocrat.
Exactly.
He sacrificed ultimate justice for regional stability. And he used the brutal execution of the servants as a pressure release valve to satisfy the public's demand for blood.
It was cold, ruthless pragmatism. But you look at the totality of this man's life, navigating these horrific crimes, rewriting the religious architecture of a nation, fighting literal wars, managing a massive corporate monopoly, negotiating with emperors, and writing poetry to his wife.
It's too much.
It is a pace of existence that no human body could sustain. He was a candle burning at both ends and in the middle.
And his body eventually gave out. Juraj Thurzo died on Christmas Day in the year 1616. He was only 49 years old.
49. It is staggering to think he accomplished more in less than 5 decades than entire royal dynasties manage in centuries.
He was buried at Orva Castle, where there is still an imposing stone monument of him in full knight's armor. But if you want to understand the sheer scale of who this man was, you don't look at his tomb, you look at his funeral.
The funeral was, well, it was an event.
Yeah.
It took place a couple of months later, on February 18, 1617, in his cultural capital of Bytočia. And the ceremony was deeply, profoundly symbolic of his life's work.
How so?
Reflecting his lifelong dedication to his people, there were 2 distinct sermons given entirely in the Slovak language, one inside the church for the nobility and one out in the courtyard for the massive crowd of commoners who came to mourn him.
And because he was the ultimate diplomat who had to balance multiple factions, they actually had someone preaching a third sermon in Hungarian, leaning out of a schoolhouse window, for the visiting dignitaries who didn't understand Slovak.
From a window.
It's such a perfect, beautiful metaphor for his life. He was a man who bridged cultures, who respected different communities, but who ultimately, finally, centered the Slovak identity that he had fought so hard to forge.
But the religious ceremony was only part of the event. The funeral concluded with a banquet that defies imagination.
Oh, the banquet.
This wasn't just a meal to feed the mourners. In the 17th century, a feast of this size was a demonstration of a dynasty's immense wealth, their logistical power, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of their political influence. To feed a crowd of this size, in the dead of winter in 1617, required an empire-level supply chain.
Okay, I have to read the actual grocery list from the historical records because it sounds make up.
Please do.
Listen to the logistics required for this one funeral banquet. They served 10 entire oxen, 43 calves, 144 rams, 341 geese, 691 hens.
And that's just the meat. The seafood required an entirely separate logistics network to transport in the winter.
Right.
169 carp, 100 trout, 750 whitefish,
Okay.
350 moray eels, 601 herring.
Plus 1,600 eggs, 233 massive vessels of wine, 114 vessels of beer, and they brought in 566 kilos of oats and 100 entire carts of straw just to manage the thousands of horses in the mud churned up by the guests.
It's unbelievable.
Think about the reality of this. 350 moray eels, 691 hens. How do you even keep hundreds of fish preserved in 1617? It shows that he had the power to command absolute, total agricultural extraction from the peasantry for a single weekend. It isn't just a funeral, it's a terrifying display of logistical dominance.
It is staggering.
Yeah.
But it perfectly matched the scale of the man.
Yeah.
Everything Juraj Thurzo did, from the religious synods he convened, to the military campaigns he fought, to the Renaissance palaces he built, to the feasts he threw, was utterly oversized.
He didn't do anything small.
Never. He operated on a frequency that the people around him could barely comprehend.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back the lens and look at the entire chaotic picture of Juraj Thurzo, we see a man composed of glaring, magnificent contradictions. He was a Catholic bishop who used his immense power to found an independent Protestant church. He was a blood-soaked warlord who wrote Greek poetry and playful letters about kissing debts. He was a supreme politician who enforced groundbreaking local equality while living a life entirely funded by a ruthless, global copper monopoly.
For you, trying to draw a lesson from this, I think Thurzo's life is a masterclass in pragmatism and leverage.
How so?
He proves that you don't have to be perfect, and your situation doesn't have to be logically consistent to make a massive impact on the world. You use whatever leverage you have at your disposal, whether that is inherited wealth, a political office you acquired through nepotism, or your terrifying reputation as a military commander, to push for the changes you deeply believe in.
Even when the system is against you.
Especially then. Even when the entire system is designed against you, you can still carve out a space for your values if you are clever enough and brave enough to hold the contradictions.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Think about the root of all of this. Think about the incredible world-spanning wealth of the Thurzo-Fugger copper monopoly.
Money behind it all.
Exactly. That copper paid for the armies, it built the palaces, it bought the political influence that kept the emperor from executing him. If Juraj's ancestors hadn't dug that copper out of the rocky ground centuries earlier, Juraj would never have had the power to protect his people.
That's a profound thought.
Would the Slovak language have ever become an official liturgical and political language? Would that cultural identity have survived the centuries? It is wild to think that the cultural identity of an entire modern nation might literally owe its existence to the market price of medieval copper.
It really is.
It makes you wonder about your own life. What is the copper in your life? What foundational resource, whether it's an education, a network, a unique skill, or a relentless passion, are you sitting on right now? And how can you use it to build a legacy that outlasts you? Because sometimes history isn't clean. Sometimes you have to wade into the murky, contradictory waters to build something beautiful.